What's up everyone, Eber here with Hardware Canucks, and here we are with another one of these graphic card reviews. And interestingly enough, we're actually taking a look at NVIDIA's affordable GPU of their RTX series. So this is the RTX 2070. And before I get into the test results and all that kind of stuff, I just want to describe this situation or this recording scenario because this is not the typical Hardware Canucks studio space. In fact, I'm actually recording this from a hotel in Beijing. So yeah, this video might be a little bit shorter than normally what you're expecting, but needless to say, all the testing has been completed before we left. Okay, so a few weeks ago, you guys may recall that we did an explain video talking about the RTX 2070, its architecture, and what NVIDIA is offering for its ridiculous $600 Founders Edition price tag. So if you're interested in learning more about the core clocks, the specs, and all that kind of stuff, I'd highly recommend checking out that video right over here. But it actually turns out that a lot of our predictions from then have been proven to be right, but some weren't. This launch is also a bit odd since there was some weird stuff going on behind the scenes. So more on that right after a message from our sponsor.
So you're saying this is the most colorful way to cool? I'm telling you, the Master Liquid ML360R RGB is the way to go. Cooler Master's new 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler is all about performance in style, with a custom low-resistance radiator and dual-chamber pump with sleeve tubing for that premium look while being totally flexible. The fans strike a balance for air pressure and airflow with transparent blades to perfectly match the colorful combination of the pump that you can sync via its own controller or through various addressable and 12-volt RGB connectors. Alright, perhaps you should check it out in the description below.
Alright, so I think it's time for some honest talk, guys, because nothing about the RTX 2070 launch has been typical, and everyone here is pretty frustrated. About a week ago, we still had no info on samples or even in communication with NVIDIA. Remember, this was just a few business days prior to a major launch, and so we decided to do a little bit of investigating. Well, it turns out that after being called out about starting at prices that never materialized for the RTX 2080 Ti and the RTX 2080, things were going to be done a bit differently this time. Instead of sending out Founders Editions for the review, NVIDIA told their board partners to sample their $500 RTX 2070s. Unfortunately, very few of them were producing those in time for launch, so they had to scramble to shift their production. We also heard that partners were told that they couldn't send out a pre-overclocked card without also sending a $500 sample, but that requirement was dropped at the last minute. NVIDIA is obviously trying to control the messaging on this launch and refocus our attention towards their entry-level RTX 2070 instead of the ultra-expensive $600 Founders Edition. I'm perfectly fine with that, provided it gives us a realistic snapshot of the market, and you know what? I don't think that's what will happen. After talking to every board partner, it seems like the majority of cards will be hitting the $550 to $600 price points. It's obvious things didn't work out like NVIDIA planned since most board partners were very late with sampling, but no one here is going to complain about having about 2 days to put this review together because you know what? We'll do whatever it takes to get you guys the info you need without crying about losing sleep or long hours. That includes filming this video on the other side of the world. Okay, so let's get to the GPUs that I'm going to be covering. First up is the ASUS RTX 2070 Turbo, which is a pretty basic blower style card, like I'm sure you can predict it'll hit the magical $500 price point. Expected to be in fairly limited supply at launch with availability at Newegg and a bit later at Amazon and other retailers. There isn't any overclock and boost frequencies is rated at 1610 MHz. The interesting thing here is that it uses a 6+8 pin layout even though TDP is rated at 175 watts. It actually looks like ASUS quickly took their RTX 2080 Turbo PCB and popped in an RTX 2070 core onto it. The other card is much more interesting in my opinion. This is the EVGA RTX 2080 XC, and it's priced at $550, despite having a custom cooler and an overclocked boost frequency of a 1710 MHz. This happens to be the same spec as the NVIDIA's Founders Edition, which costs a good $50 more. The XC is a bit long at 10.6 inches, but nothing like some of the alternatives like ASUS's Strix OC or MSI's Duke series. EVGA also happens to have a longer, more comprehensive warranty than NVIDIA, and this card should be widely available right at launch. We're also going to approach comparisons a bit differently in this video and focus on the cards that are representative of the overall market right now. The problem is that buyers have less and less choice when it comes to alternatives to the RTX 2070 unless they go into the used market. The GTX 1080 and GTX 1070 Ti are in short supply all around, but the GTX 1070 is a bit better, but they're still going up in price. So here's a quick list of the cards that I'm going to be using here along with their current approximate prices. Unfortunately, some of these have been increasing lately because of low supply versus high demand, so be aware of that. I'll leave a link in the description to the lowest priced and in-stock GTX 10 series cards I could find, but these were the ones we either had on hand or purchased in the last few weeks. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's jump right into the benchmarks, starting first with how well the EVGA and ASUS RTX 2070 cards can maintain their clock speeds. I was a bit worried that the blower style card from ASUS would hit some higher temperatures, but that didn't really happen. The max it achieved was 73 degrees Celsius, but the EVGA XC's dual fan downdraft cooler ended up easily beating it with its peak temp of 68 degrees Celsius. You can also see that in order to maintain the 73 degrees Celsius mark, the ASUS Turbo had to fluctuate its clock speeds quite a bit, and it ended up running around 1680 MHz, which is right in line with the specs. EVGA, on the other hand, is really stable after it settles around 1810 MHz. But how does this all translate into performance and games? Well, let's roll the benchmarks. You're more than welcome to pause on any of them if you want to take a closer look at them. Just keep in mind that in order to reduce CPU bottlenecks, we're running all these tests on an i9-7900X overclocked to 4.74 GHz with 32 GB of memory overclocked to 3600 MHz. So there you have an idea of where these two cards stack up to the competition, but there's some other things that we need to look into first. Let's talk about power consumption first, since the RTX cards have absolutely huge cores and do tend to require a lot of juice. So it turns out that power consumption isn't all that bad for either of these cards right now, with both needing less than an overclocked GTX 1080, but what we don't know is what will happen to these numbers when RTX features are enabled. Remember, a lot of the die space is taken up by the RT and Tensor cores, and in normal applications, those aren't being used. Okay, now on to sound testing. I was a bit worried that the ASUS RTX 2070 Turbo would be quite loud, but it actually wasn't. It's a bit louder than the downdraft coolers, but you are also getting the advantage of exhausting hot air outside the case. That could be a real benefit if you're using a smaller form factor system. And for the EVGA XC, well, what can we say? It's very, very quiet. Well, the benchmarks certainly provide an interesting insight into the RTX 2070's place in the market. However, actually buying a GPU right now isn't an easy process at all, and that's because the existing 10 series, GTX 10 series cards are getting harder and harder to find, and prices are kind of all over the place. I mean, if you look hard enough, you may be able to find a GTX 1080 for $470 or a 1070 Ti for $400, but for the most part, they are either a little bit more expensive than that price point, or they are out of stock. Now you could look, the used market is certainly an option to look into, but they are flooded with mining GPUs, so watch out for those. Anyways, coming back to the RTX 2070, and I've talked about the whole mess surrounding this launch, so I'm not going to touch on that again, but it is very clear that the $600 RTX 2070 Founders Edition is a ridiculously overpriced GPU, period. Luckily, we were able to benchmark the two other cards. So the ASUS RTX 2070 ended up going back and forth with the EVGA GTX 1080 SC2 in the tests, but ended up just ahead at both 1440p and 4K. Remember, this is a reference RTX 2070 versus an overclocked card, but at the same time, the prices are about the same at $500. The real question is whether or not the Turbo or any other $500 RTX 2070 card will be widely available at launch. I have a feeling that they won't be based on our talks with board partners. Now with the EVGA RTX 2070 XE is a bit more interesting since for 10% more than the ASUS card, you're getting 4 to 6% better performance, improved cooling results, and quieter operation. But being interesting doesn't make it a good value. It's just less expensive than the overpriced RTX 2070 Founders Edition, RTX 2080, and the RTX 2080 Ti. Even with the RTX 2070 that's available right now, I think people should still wait and see how the market fares into 2019 before jumping into RTX. Because prices are actually a little bit or quite a bit higher than what the 1070 and the GTX 1070 Ti used to be at launch. And you know, the RTX features that you're paying for right now aren't necessarily available at the time of making this video. So it's really pointless to jump into a platform that offers or that has features that just can't be taken advantage of. Meanwhile, the performance of these cards aren't drastically, or they're not a significant improvement over what the GTX 1070 series cards used to offer for about a year or so, and I think that's a problem, guys. So there you guys have it. While the RTX 2070 is finally here, it's really hard to get excited about a GPU that costs $500. I'm Ibar with Hardware Canucks. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think about this GPU in the comments down below. Subscribe to our new Boot Sequence channel right over here for the latest tech news and rumors. You can also check out some relevant content over here as well. I'm signing off, and I'll see you guys in the next one.